To speak or not to speak? That has been the question for much of American history. You see, there's always been a topic that made the majority of Americans uncomfortable. There's always been a topic that if you just didn't talk about, then people would be okay with it. Now, many times that topic has changed and shifted, and now in American society, there are many topics that are just taboo to speak about. In fact, one time in the House of Representatives, it went so bad that the House passed what's called the Gag Rule. And it said there's a topic that is so sensitive and so offensive that if anyone talks about it, they could get in trouble. Well, back then the topic was slavery. And John Quincy Adams, a representative who had been president and been elected to the House, did not like the Gag Rule. He believed it was an attack on the freedom of speech. He believed that as an American citizen, he should be able to talk about slavery, even if it made Southern slaveholders uncomfortable. And so he fought it. He argued against it. He did all sorts of crazy political conniving to break the rule without actually breaking the rule and getting into trouble. In fact, there's one story where he had a petition of 22 slaves. Now, historians argue whether this petition was actually from 22 slaves or if he just said that it was. But the irony is that it was a petition of 22 slaves asking that John Adams stop talking about slavery. And he brought this up, and in the petition, the slaves were saying, by you always talking about slavery, you're making our slavery worse. Please, Northern abolitionist guy, stop trying to get us freed. We don't want your help. Well, Adams, in his speech, says he believed this was a petition designed by their master, where he just got their slave to sign it. And at first, he feigned that he was, he didn't want to bring it to the attention of the Congress because he felt like the slaves were being manipulated by their master, because if the master can tell the slaves to do whatever he wants, of course he can have them sign a petition or even make their mark. But then craftily he said, I realize that these people live in America. And according to the Constitution, we count them in the 3/5 agreement for a representation. So they have the right to petition. And I think we should bring this petition onto the floor of the Congress, and we should debate the petition that tells me I shouldn't be able to talk about slavery. And the Southern delegates went loony. Because if you can allow slaves to petition, what else can you allow them to do? I mean, if you give them the freedom of petition, do they get the freedom of speech? Do they get the freedom of religion? Do they get the freedom of assembly? Do they get, oh my goodness, freedom? And so there was this huge uproar and argument in the House. And the petition was never formally recognized. But Adams was able to rail against slavery because they didn't want a petition. He did many, many things like this. He believed that the Gag Rule was an attack on American liberty. You see, freedom is a very precious thing, and it's built on truth. And truth has to have debate. Because if I have an opinion and you have a different opinion, and we talk about it, and we argue, and we share our viewpoints, what is true will emerge. And we may never agree, and Americans have been famous for disagreeing ever since we started our country. When we have the freedom to disagree, then we are able to create a society of freedom. Whenever there is an attack on the freedom to speak and to debate and to disagree, society slowly begins to close off the freedoms. It starts with the freedom of speech. When there are gag rules, whether they're official or whether it's just societal, oh, you can't talk about that, well, then people start to live in fear. And where there is fear, there is no freedom. There were certain things you could not say in Maoist China. There were many things you could not say in Stalinist Russia. There were tons of things you could not say in Nazi Germany. But to live in a society where you can say whatever you want, where you can share your opinions, that's freedom. The freedom of speech has certain limitations. And one of those limitations is you can't say things that will openly cause violence to happen on another group. I cannot say, I don't like this group and I think we should rally and beat them up. That is not a freedom that is protected. But many times in our society today, the freedom to just share my opinion that I'm a Christian, that I don't believe in evolution, that I have certain opinions on gender, or I have certain opinions in politics, or I have certain opinions on morality, our society is starting to say, you cannot share those opinions because they're offensive. And if you disagree with a certain prevailing view, then name-calling happens. You're homophobic, you're racist, you're sexist, you're a hater, you're bad. John Quincy Adams believed that the Gag Rule was awful because you should be able to share your opinion and debate and talk. You see, the reason the slavers didn't want there to be debate was because they knew they were wrong. They knew it was immoral. They knew we can't stand up against the scrutiny of truth and open debate. And so they said, we're not going to debate this. You can't talk about this. It's unacceptable to talk about this. You're offending me. Another thing that makes America great is we have separation of church and state. We have freedom to worship because our government doesn't dictate a certain type of religion and put it on everyone. In the New Testament, it says, where there is liberty, there the Spirit of the Lord is. And there's a connection between God's presence and freedom. You see, God is love. And love cannot be forced. I cannot grab my 5-year-old girl and shake her and say, you will love me. When I do, if I did that, she would immediately be afraid of me. I can't force my wife to love me and threaten her and manipulate her. I mean, she might do what I want, but she won't love me. God knows that. There's so much manipulation in Christianity where we're like, oh, if you don't love God, then you're going to burn in hell. Oh, if you break the Sabbath, well, then God's not going to bless you. Oh, if you don't do these things, then God will send COVID back and you'll get sick. And that doesn't come from God because that's manipulation. God is the God of freedom. You see, God can handle our tough questions. God can handle us debating organs or drums, or this type of music or that type of music, or this theology versus that theology, or this verse versus that verse. God's not afraid of debate. He's not afraid of scrutiny because he can take it. Many times in our churches, there are ideas that we just can't share because it might make some people uncomfortable. And while, like Paul, we always want to be sensitive to the feelings of others, and especially new Christians who are just exploring, we should never give in to the fear to not share what we believe is true. During the time of Rome, there was a gag order against Christianity. And guys like Paul and Peter and John, they spoke out. In fact, the Sanhedrin took Peter and John into their chambers one time after they healed a guy, and they said, okay, we can't say you didn't heal him because the evidence is clear, but we can say, don't talk about Jesus. It offends me. Don't talk about Jesus. It makes us uncomfortable. Don't talk about Jesus. It's illegal. And Peter and John said, you decide what's better, to listen to God or to listen to you. Now, I do have strong political opinions, and I do believe that I should be able to share those opinions. But that's on a lower level. Let's talk about God's truth. We can see in our society how sharing the gospel is becoming less and less acceptable. And we believe that there will be a time where you just can't share what you believe is true when it comes to God. And we need to think about it now. Are we going to accept the gag order and say, well, It's just not acceptable anymore. I can't share the gospel. Well, I could get in trouble. Well, it's against the rules. Well, I could go to jail. Well, I could lose my life. Well, I could lose my job. Are we going to listen to society's pressures? Or are we going to listen to Jesus, who said, go. Go make disciples. Tell them what I've told you. Go everywhere. If they disagree with you, shake the dust off your feet. But go, because we need to share the good news. We need to respect the freedom of speech. Because where there is liberty, there's the presence of God. Don't be afraid. Share the truth God puts on your heart, because He's got this. God bless.